Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Paul Goldbart, College of Natural Sciences Dean, and I want to thank you for participating in the book discussions as part of CNS Connect. I applaud you, I really do applaud you for making time to explore and to discuss the big ideas, complex challenges that underlie the day-to-day work that we do here in the College of Natural Sciences and at the University of Texas at Austin. And the kind of things that you're thinking of are the critically important themes that that are introduced and analyzed and explored in the book that we're going to discuss today. So with intensive reporting, captivating real-world stories, The Years That Matter Most is an analysis of higher education in America that is not all rosy. Nevertheless, there is cause for hope, including right here in Texas. As research for this book, author Paul Tough embedded himself here in the Austin campus, attending seminars, going to meetings, observing study groups, and even enrolling in a semester-long freshman calculus class. We're truly fortunate to be joined by the author himself today to begin our conversation. Paul Tough is the author most recently of The Years That Matter Most, How College Makes Us or Breaks Us. His three previous books include How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character, which was translated into 27 languages and spent more than a year on the New York Times hardcover and paperback bestseller lists. Paul is a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, where he has written extensively about education, parenting, poverty, and politics. His writing has also appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, GQ, Esquire, as well as on the op-ed page of the New York Times. He has worked as an editor at the New York Times Magazine and Harper's Magazine, and as a reporter and producer for the public radio program This American Life. And he was the founding editor of Open Letters, an online magazine. Paul lives with his wife and two sons in Austin, Texas and Montauk, New York. Welcome, Paul. It's good to have you back with us. Before we hand things off to Paul, I'm going to ask Antonia to go over a few logistical items about the webinar and how you can best participate as an audience member. Thank you once again to everybody for joining us. Over to you, Antonia.
Thank you, Dean Goldbart. And thank you everyone for being here today. In just a few minutes, Paul Tough will share with us, and then we will open up the floor for some Q&A. Today, just so you know, this is being recorded. The remarks from Paul Tough and the Q&A will be posted on the CNS Connect webpage for viewing at a later time. At this time, we'd like to invite you to go ahead and turn on your cameras so that way we can have an interactive discussion once the Q&A is up and going. During the Q&A at the end of Paul's remarks, you can go ahead and use the raise your hand function and use the chat function as well. I'll be moderating that Q&A section. And after the Q&A, participants will be broken out into smaller groups for further discussion, which will last until 4:30 our time. So at this time, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Paul Tough.
Well, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So nice to be with you virtually in Austin. I am up in Montauk, New York right now, where it's a scorching 75 degrees. I'm sure you can really relate. But it is nice to be connected with Austin, where we live most of the time. So thank you so much for taking part in this book club, for choosing my book, for reading it. It means a lot to me for anyone to read the book, but it especially means a lot to me to have folks at UT and at the College of Natural Sciences reading the book, because the college was such a big part of the reporting of this book, as Dean Goldbart said. It's a place where I feel like so many of my ideas about what higher education could be were formed. So as Antonia said, I'm going to talk for 10 minutes or so, and then looking forward to answering any questions from you that I can. But I thought for these 10 minutes, you know, I think all or most of you have read the book. So rather than tell you what's in the book, I thought I would instead talk a little bit about what has changed in the world since this book came out last September, everything, and how I feel like that my thinking about these questions has changed. I'm thinking about it right now because I'm working on an afterword for the book that is coming out in the paperback, going to be part of the paperback, which is coming out next January. So I'm kind of rethinking everything that I wrote in the book, but also, you know, this is a year and a summer where I think a lot of us are rethinking a lot of things. And a lot of, I think, what is on my mind and a lot of our minds this summer is inequality, the inequalities that are baked into so much of the American system these days. And really that idea of inequality is at the center of the book. We're actually going to publish the paperback with a new title. The Years That Matter Most seemed a little soft for this moment. So instead we're calling it The Inequality Machine. Which is something that a reader said to me, a phrase a reader said to me as their vision of what higher education looked like after reading my book. And it made a lot of sense to me. And so I think as we think about inequality in America, especially these days, we tend to think about it in places other than higher education. We think about it in policing, in criminal justice. We think about it in terms of housing, in terms of neighborhoods. We think about it in terms of politics and voting. But what struck me a few years ago when I started work on this book was the way that higher education is a force for inequality in America today. And I think that is a counterintuitive notion for a lot of us. I think that that our instinct is that higher education is this force for mobility. And as you know, if you've read the book, it is for some people, right? And as you know from your work, there are amazing stories happening every day of young people whose lives are transformed through higher education, who go from one set of opportunities to another because of those 4 years in college. But it doesn't always work out that way. And in fact, you know, when you look at the numbers overall in terms of the effect that higher education has, it's hard not to conclude that as an institution, it is really a force not for social mobility, but for social closure, that it is something that that solidifies, that calcifies the status quo for so many young people. And so I saw that in my reporting at a place like Princeton, where I spent some time, you know, with some of the most privileged students in the country, and looked at how hard it was for one young woman who didn't come from that kind of background to make it there and then to succeed there. I saw that inequality as well at, you know, Catawba Valley Community College in Western North Carolina, where the student who I followed, who was trying to become a welder at his community college, was thwarted by all kinds of systemic inequities and obstacles that the system put in his path. And I would even say that it is true at UT. UT for me in this book was really something that I used as an example of the power of mobility and the possibility of mobility in higher education. And I believe that's true. I mean, I wrote that because that's what I found when I was there in Uri Treisman's calculus class, talking with David Lottie and the work that he was doing, trying to transform the success rates for different students at UT. And so I know that it's a place where mobility is happening all the time. But I also think that there's something about the fact of mobility at UT that is sort of an accident, right? It's not necessarily that UT has just figured things out that no one else has. I mean, I was struck by how much the top 10% rule that was imposed on UT from outside sort of accidentally contributed to this much more diverse student population than most flagship state universities, public universities have today. And then I was struck, you know, in my reporting on David Lottie and his work by how that was a little bit accidental too, right? It came from the governor being upset about what UT was doing, and graduation rates seemed like a place where the different sides could agree, you know, this is something we can get together on. And then David Lottie, I think there was also a lot of leadership from him and others, turning those accidents into an opportunity to create more equity, more diversity, and more success for lots of students at UT. But I also think, there is still a lot to do. And there are still lots of ways that UT can do better in terms of enhancing the opportunities for a wider range of students. And I think this is a moment this summer, certainly this has been what's on my mind this summer, is how the institutions that I represent and am part of are promoting mobility and equity and are holding it back, are making the system less fair. So it's the thing that I would love to hear from you about today. I'm happy to answer any questions you've got, but I'm really interested in your thinking. I'm guessing that you, like me, have been changed by what's happened in this country in the last few months. And I'm interested by the question of how you feel it connects to your work at the college. Whether you feel like there are things that CNS can do differently and UT can do differently to create more equity. One of the great puzzles for me of higher education, it was sort of the question that was at the back of my mind throughout all my reporting, is how this institution that is can be such a force for social mobility, that is populated by so many people in leadership who are progressive and committed to equity and mobility, how it turned out that higher education became this force that was thwarting mobility for so many people. And I hope, I'm nervous about this fall and the next few years, and I'm sure all of you are as well. Nervous about it in all sorts of ways, but in the sort of medium to long term, I'm especially nervous about what the pandemic and the economic challenges that are coming along with it are going to do to social mobility as budgets get cut, as tuition becomes more important, as students who might be able to afford a certain tuition, as their families lose jobs and opportunities, as they have to choose work instead of college. I'm worried about what all those things, all those forces will do to the strides that UT has made in the last few years. I'm worried about it at every institution. But I would love to hear your thoughts about how the pandemic is going to affect things and what we, UT, can do to try to mitigate the worst parts of those forces. And I think the question that I feel like a lot of people that I've spoken to at UT are asking, and that I hope more and more individuals at more and more institutions can start thinking about, is how to make mobility sort of a core part of an institution's identity. And I just don't think it is at most institutions of higher education. I think there are a lot of noble goals that institutions have, but I don't think that most institutions think of that as their function, to create more social mobility. And I think it should be, and it can be. And I think that UT has shown that with certain types of efforts and a little bit of accidental luck, that can really happen, and it can really have a transformative effect on students like Yvonne Martinez, the young woman from San Antonio who I wrote about in Uri Treisman's class. So thanks for thinking that through with me. I'd love to turn things now over to Antonia to hear any questions that you might have.
While you were talking, Paul, there was a couple of things that came into the chat box. Someone commented that they're concerned about students and their access to technology in light of the pandemic, and how a lot of them have been forced to utilize technology in those formats, and they might not have access to that.
Yes.
Any comments on that?
I'm very concerned about that too. I mean, so I don't know specifically. Maybe Dean Goldbart can tell us something about the answer to some of these questions. But I think it's critical for institutions to provide technological support to students who don't have that. So when the pandemic struck, I was a student at Austin Community College. I was taking a woodworking class there, which was really, really hard to make the transition onto remote learning, doing woodworking, I'll tell you. But it gave me some access to what was going on at ACC. And, you know, it's a huge issue. Technology was a huge issue for a lot of their students. So they, you know, created Wi-Fi hotspots in their parking lots and were giving out laptops to students. I'm not sure if they were able to do enough, but I think especially with their student population, they realized this was going to be a big issue. So I think I hope that UT is thinking the same way and is providing those sorts of technological supports to students. I think though like we need more too. Like the digital divide is not just about the technology itself. I'm doing some reporting this summer about seniors in public high schools in New York City who are trying to figure out what they're going to do this fall, not super high achieving seniors. So who are thinking about 2-year schools or 4-year public institutions. And for them, you know, it's just about having a quiet place to study. It's about having a place to do Zoom. The digital divide, I think, just really goes to the heart of how they're living their lives. So I hope UT can think about this as a problem that is partly theirs to solve.
Thank you, Paul. We have a hand raised, Jen Moon. I'm gonna go ahead and ask you to unmute now.
All right, thank you. And thank you for being here today. This is super exciting. I've been like looking forward to this all summer. The first thing I wanted to say is, I'm curious about, you know, when we have Zoom and we have our cameras on and that level of exposure that we now have to our students, like our students see our kids running in the background, we're seeing kind of where they are sometimes. And I think that makes some of this a lot more visible in terms of the student experience and where they're coming from. And when I was reading your book, I was so struck, like, this is you know, I just didn't have the sort of concrete awareness of the experiences of many of our students and just getting here. And I think that was, I mean, talk about privilege. I mean, I was just like, hey, they're all here. They're all smart. Let's go. We're all in the same, you know what I mean? So I think there might be something good that comes out of all this crazy COVID business, which is now we can be a little more real and hopefully empathetic to one another, to understand that people come from vastly different backgrounds and struggle with technology. So that could be something that at least raises the awareness of this issue to everyone, so that when I interact with my students this fall, I'm now thinking about them in a totally different way.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
I mean, yes. So I think absolutely the fact that we can see into our students' lives, that they can see into our lives, is a huge benefit. And especially, I think if it makes us sort of more, makes instructors more sensitive, more humane. I think it's also like it's a double-edged sword though. Like I think about Kiki Gilbert, the student I wrote about who went to Princeton, and how much, you know, it was hard for her being at Princeton. It was stressful, it was painful in all sorts of ways, but it was so important to her to have this opportunity to choose what she wanted to represent of her past, right? Like that she did not want to represent all of her past. And that was a struggle for her, and she never felt quite right about it. And I think it's going to be a struggle her whole life as she you know, continues to experience incredible social mobility and to come from where she came. But I think, you know, it is one of the nice things about UT that when you're, or any university like UT, that those social divisions do become a little bit invisible in the classroom, right? And so there's a downside to that because we can forget about them, but there's an upside to it as well because it lets students sort of reinvent themselves. And so, so I worry about the other side of the coin as well. And I wonder what you experienced this spring, but I think if this continues into the fall, that students just don't get that experience of leaving what they came from and being able to start new.
Thanks.
Okay, Shelley, would you go ahead and unmute?
I worry that we're not changing the institutions at all. I mean, that we're remaining basically what we were 100 years ago. We were created for and by people who were essentially privileged. And we're trying to make people fit that mold rather than fundamentally changing how we think about and do education. And I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on ways that we might flip this around to really think about changing us and how we're doing this, rather than trying to take students and making them fit what we're doing.
Yeah, I think it's a really important paradigm that you're describing. And again, I feel like like the answer has to involve a little bit of both, you know. And I mean, I really looked at Uri Treisman and what he was doing in his freshman calculus class, because he was absolutely respecting students' differences. He was very attuned to where they came from. He was talking to them in great detail about where they came from. He was acknowledging the financial, educational, social differences of students from different walks of life. But he was also, you know, hammering home this message that we are all Longhorns, you know, that we're all now part of this new team. And it's, you know, part of what is so complicated about being a college student. It's part of what's so complicated about being an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old, that you are undergoing this big transition where you don't, you want to respect where you came from, and have that acknowledged and not lose sight of it altogether. But you also want to become something new. And so I think absolutely you're right that we need to think about it more and address it more and be more aware of the differences of students coming into the college and how they feel differently, how they experience things differently, what they need that's different. And I think there are lots of ways that UT has been doing that really well over the last few years. But I think at the same time, you know, there's a risk of separating students too much and saying, okay, you're one kind of student, so you live in that housing and experience that kind of UT, and these students will experience a different kind of UT. Part of the job of an institution like UT, I think, is giving students a new identity, or giving them at least the opportunity for a new identity, and that's tricky business.
And Paul, in the comments, there's a comment about the informal academic experiences and non-academic experiences that shape students while they are at a university, and kind of that there's a lack of that right now, or how that will look differently in this climate. So do you have any comments about looking into the future and how that might impact, or what that could look like?
Yeah, I think it's huge. I mean, you know, I don't envy any of you trying to work out a reopening plan. I think it's going to be a work in progress for a long time, and a very difficult one. But I think it's easy to overlook how important those informal experiences are. I was really struck by, you know, Harvard releasing their reopening plan a day or two ago, that they are, you know, bringing all the freshmen to campus and not doing any in-person classes. And you know, on one hand, it seems kind of crazy, but I also think that there's something about it that makes sense, that there is this value in being on campus, on being, you know, I'm sure they're going to have lots of limits on social situations and gatherings, but it's an acknowledgement that that physical presence in a place, the connections that students get outside of the classroom are just as important as what happens inside the classroom. So I don't know whether that particular hybrid is the right one, but I do think that I worry that it might be, you know, in all the many things that universities are thinking about as they're trying to reopen, that might get forgotten, just how important the informal side of the college experience is.
And we have a hand raised. Kristen, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, everyone. Coming back to Shelley's comment about changing institutions, it comes, you know, just comes to my mind that UT, I think even more so than some other institutions, really focuses on a four-year degree. And I wonder if maybe sometimes that kind of degree doesn't serve all students, and maybe some flexibility in terms of what the offerings are. Maybe sometimes people might want to come for a semester or for some evening classes or whatever, to just get what they need, rather than work for this thing that we tell them is what we do. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
It's a great question. I mean, I absolutely feel like there are students who need alternatives to a four-year degree. I also feel like I think there is something about a four-year residential degree that is really important. There's something about that experience. You know, I think there is there's a lot of talk, and I think there's going to continue to be a lot of talk about this idea that you know, is college, is the value of college something that you can get through a screen? Is it really, you know, more about skills development than it is about anything else? And I keep coming back to this idea, you know, partly because of the reporting that I did there with Uri Trasman and David Lottie and others. How much of what students get, whether they're from privilege or from a lack of privilege, how much they get in terms of that identity formation. And I think, you know, being in a place for some time is a big part of that. So on the one hand, yes, absolutely, we need to have better pathways. You know, I feel like more connection between Austin Community College and UT, for instance, where those two institutions are really serving as partners and are offering different alternatives to similar students, I think would be great. You know, as an ACC student, I'm really convinced that it is an institution with a lot of potential that serves a lot of students right now. You will have lots of challenges with the pandemic, but I think it's positioned well to benefit. Their student population went up this summer, despite the fact they were entirely online. So I do think that two-year opportunities are necessary, and I think they should be more integrated into UT. I worry a little bit about creating like a two-tiered UT, right, where there is one kind of offering for one sort of student and another for another sort of student. And even if a twin system didn't start off as being for different demographics, I worry that it would end up that way. So it's a concern that I've sort of always had about new types of higher ed offerings. And I don't think the pandemic's gonna solve that problem for me. I think while we're looking for alternatives, we also have to watch and make sure that we don't create more stratification in higher ed while doing it.
Okay, thank you. Dean Vandenbout, would you like to unmute yourself?
So I'm just curious, Paul, about your thoughts about whether we should stop doing some things which unintentionally create inequities, even though they're lovely ideas. So for example, COVID has amplified everything. Any inequity that existed is now in stark relief. So in the fall, I'm going to imagine that we will have some students back on campus in our current plans, but I know that there'll be lots and lots of students who are not coming back because they can't afford to live in Austin. And so even if they would like to come back, their circumstances will say that they're not going to be here. Should we stop having undergraduates involved in research because the only people who will be on campus and able to partake in those activities are the wealthy kids? That's not our plan right now, but every time I look at everything we're doing, it continues to be something that now the opportunities continue to pile up for the folks who can take advantage of them. And the low socioeconomic kids are, I mean, their challenges are mounted tenfold. You know, when we survey them, not only do they have bad technology, they don't have a quiet place at home, they have huge family obligations, they have massive financial impact. And at some point I just wonder, like, are we contributing even more because we continue to offer what are great opportunities, but now people can't take advantage of them?
I think it's a great question, and I feel like that's exactly the kind of thinking that I'm hoping that you all are doing and can do more of. I mean, you know, my thinking is like when you take that inequity, which I think you're probably right. There are lots of people at UT who have not yet hit the thought process of realizing that inequity is going to, you know, be accidentally made worse rather than better. Rather than say like, well, let's do less and let's just get rid of those research opportunities, my hope would be to try to figure out how to do more, how to create research opportunities for students who aren't there, how to find ways for you know, create more support for students who can't get to campus to get there, to create, you know, satellites in San Antonio or El Paso or somewhere else where there are a lot of students who can't make it, where they can gather together and get some sense of UT Austin community far from Austin, and do research together or something. I don't know the solution to that problem, but I feel like I'm glad you're thinking of it as a problem. I just hope there's a solution that's not just doing away with it, but that's finding a way to retain it, but also make it more equitable.
Just to be clear, we're not doing away with it. I just every now and again think like, oh, should we do it? Right?
Yeah, but it's exactly. I mean, I think if you don't think those big thoughts of like, oh wait, this thing that we've always done that just seems like the natural thing to do, if we don't tinker with it, it is going to make things worse. I think you're right. There are hundreds that I haven't thought of things like that. I'm sure that are going to happen this fall. And so I think being aware of that and proactive about trying to solve those problems is essential.
Well, thank you, Paul. We're just about at the point to wrap up our discussion. Dean Goldbart, did you have anything that you'd like to say further before we wrapped up? I know you were furiously taking some notes there, so I wanted to give you a moment.
There's many things I'd love to ask, but I don't want to delay the breakout groups too much, but I want to just mention a couple of things. One thing that is very much on my mind is this issue of really undoing whatever leveling the universities were providing. And as you and as David Vandenbout have said, we're really reverting to a position of great inequity, really troubling. There's certainly efforts by UT early on, and they continue to provide technological support, computers, Wi-Fi access, and so forth. But I don't know how we can get about solving people's home problems where you have 5 people around the table all struggling for bandwidth. So this is probably beyond us, even though we're desperately aware of it. But the point I wanted to make is this. I would like to see us on campus move to a situation where we really acknowledge that we are a community where in many respects the stakes are very low. And we really should be having the kind of vigorous discussions between sectors of our community to learn from one another and learn about one another's experiences. And I worry that we have sort of really fractionated into sort of sub-communities who are talking to one another, talking within themselves, but not to one another. And I really learned most about this from a person I rather admire named Nancy Cantor, who is the Chancellor of Rutgers Newark campus, who has often talked about the remarkable possibilities in the great public universities, bringing people from extraordinarily different backgrounds together to really learn about one another. But I worry that over the past 5 years and maybe more, there's a kind of anxiety, a kind of fear that's set in, and we're all terrified of saying the wrong thing in the wrong setting, even though the stakes are really relatively low. And I wondered if you have any words of wisdom about how we can come together and really learn about one another's life experiences and be sort of welded together through our classroom and extracurricular experiences, so that when we go forward, we can be the strands of the fabric of society that hold society together and keep us away from this tribalism.
You want me to answer that one? Wow. Sure. So, I mean, I think these are questions that I think a lot of other people, maybe us white males more than other, are belatedly thinking about a lot this year in the summer. And they're really important questions, and they're really hard questions. I mean, again, I feel inspired by a lot of what I saw in Uri Treisman's classroom and in his office hours, because and in my my interviews, my conversations with so many of his students. I wrote about Yvonne, but I spent time with lots of time with a dozen students in his class, and what really struck me was that that class was a place where talking about different experiences was really normalized, and that made it easier for me as a journalist to talk about those things. And it's tricky business, both as a reporter and as a professor doing that. And I'm sure I and he both made mistakes along the way, but I think we both were in our own way, me as a journalist and him as a professor, we're trying to be sensitive and humble about what we didn't know. And not pretending to be more attuned with different people than we were, but also being genuinely interested in how we were different and what other people's stories were. And that is a lot of what I think made that class so important to me, not only as a person, as a Texan, but as a journalist, being able to have those experiences. And I think there's something of a model there, that those conversations that I think often feel so fraught, and often genuinely are fraught, on like at a distance on Twitter, on the op-ed page, they seem very difficult to have those conversations face to face. A couple of people, a few people, having those conversations, respecting each other, learning from each other. I don't think it's so hard. I think we're naturally wired to that kind of empathy and that kind of connection, even across really big differences. And so I think it's an overdue conversation. I think it's one, certainly one thing I took from my reporting is that it's one that is really essential to have. Without having those conversations, I think it's really difficult to progress as an institution, and to help students progress the way they need to. So I'm glad, even though it's often fraught, these conversations now, I'm glad we're starting to have them. And I'm hoping that UT and other institutions can be places where those conversations happen more often.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much, and for sort of giving some hope to the possibility of these kinds of conversations. Let me sign off by saying thank you very much for joining us again. Really enormously appreciate it. One of the things you do when we get together is I think you inspire us to have the courage to shake ourselves up, not to just tinker with the 19th century universities that we did when we built the 20th century ones, but to do something really bold and really to construct the university for the 21st century. And if there's one good thing that's come out of COVID-19, and maybe is inspired by Black Lives Matter, it is this encouragement to go forward and take what's been shaken loose and make something really better out of it. So thanks for giving us the courage to do that.
Well, thanks for all you're doing. Good. Well, I appreciate everything you all are doing this summer and this fall. It's hard work you're doing, so thank you for doing that.